I'm going to be going over how I use my investment process second brain as context for Claude and how I've set up Claude as an agent to help me in my investment process. I'll be going over some of the use cases of this system with an example from Reddit, which is one of my portfolio holdings and just reported earnings. I'm excited to show you guys how powerful I think this process can be and how it can fuel investment returns. If we look at how my portfolio has been performing relative to the benchmarks, you can see relative to the S&P, we've been outperforming by a wide margin. This is largely due to the gains I've had in Google and how concentrated I was in that position during 2025. But if we look at the year-to-date performance after earnings, you can see that I'm now outperforming the S&P. It's been good to see this performance as a confirming piece of data that my process with the second brain is working and helping me adhere to my strategy. If we look at the companies that have started to do really well after earnings, I'm going to be going over my Reddit position and the use case with Claude and the second brain and how I'm breaking down the earnings report. After earnings, Reddit was up 13%. It's good to start seeing this investment play out. I'm going to use Claude, my second brain, and the recent earnings report from Reddit to help backtest my thesis that I've already written out in my second brain. This is not going to be a video of how I've set up my second brain. I went over that in the first video on this channel. I'll have linked in the description. This is going to be a video of how I've integrated this with Claude and how I'm using it as context for better investment results. I'll be going over how I use the second brain as context for backtesting my thesis, checking for cognitive biases, portfolio stress tests, and any other application you can think of. Because I track my research in Obsidian, as I continue to add more notes to the second brain, it will add more context to Claude, which will form a flywheel of investment knowledge and continual investment process refinement as the second brain context grows. This should help utilize the sheer productive power of AI as an individual investor. This combination of a second brain and Claude will almost act like a second member of an investment team that can be increasingly immune to cognitive biases, help me adhere to my portfolio strategy, invert my investment thesis, and make sure that any prospective investment aligns with my portfolio strategy. Claude will also use the web and internet in addition to my second brain and any context I give it to help enhance the decisions that I make with the portfolio. If we come over to Claude, I want to explain a little bit how I've set up my second brain as context for my investment process. So within Claude, you can set up individual skills with the type of context you want to give it. So I've tailored this skill within Claude. If we come up here, Claude's given us a description. You can see here it said it loads my domain expansion, which is just the file name that tracks my investment philosophy. It has my checklist. I write down my thesis as well as decision-making notes and cognitive bias. And then I've set up 4 active workflows for now that I spoke about a little bit earlier. One is the stress test an existing thesis. The second is potential new investment ideas. The third is a portfolio fit check. And the fourth is a bias audit and earnings retest. So this will take any new earnings report and test it against the notes that I already have in my second brain on an existing company. And so I can use this skill anytime I ask Claude about investing, valuation, management, moats, capital allocation, position sizing, portfolio construction, everything. And so I'm really excited to get this integrated into the second brain. I think it'll really add to the channel and the research that we do. So if we actually get into how this works, what Claude does is it loads all the files or individual notes in my second brain. This is everything I have on how I want to invest, everything in my second brain that was in the investment process node tree that we track here on the channel. And so as this grows, the context will grow as well. This is the part of where it says loads PJ's lens, right? This is loading everything I have in my second brain. And then it just runs the workflows that I give it. So I can just prompt it in the Cowork section of Claude and it'll do this work for me. And so the great thing about Claude is it's actually an agent. And so it can actually write new notes in my second brain for me as a response. Obviously, I don't want my second brain to become AI slop. I want my own research and work and reading to go into the context and just have individual notes that Claude can give me to help supplement my thinking on a company. Here it says, by default, completed analysis are drafted as markdown files into the rough notes section of Obsidian. If I think that they're worth keeping, or if I want to take part of it and augment it and make a new note, then I can transfer that to my main notes, which will then be used as context into Claude in the future, and that I'll keep more permanently in my second brain. And so Claude goes over a little bit about when to use this skill. It talks about some of the companies I've researched, because as you continue to use Claude and as I'll continue to build up my second brain, the context and the training of the actual skill within Claude will grow. My second brain I use for stuff other than investing, and so I've made sure that this strictly sticks to the investment notes that I have in there. I've set up individual notes in my second brain to go over every single time I give it a prompt. These are some of the more foundational notes I have about my investment strategy that I'm not going to get into in this video. I got into a lot of those in the first video I released, and I'll continue to go over individual notes as I do in videos. But going through some of them quickly, obviously margin of safety, downside protection first before we chase returns, bottom-up research, obviously qualitative and management. And then we have the notes on concentration and quality, how I define risk. And so here are the individual workflows and how I can prompt different workflows. So for a stress test, this is how you could prompt it. It'll find the existing notes on a company. It'll read those notes. It'll run it against a checklist and give me a pass, concern, fail, or unknown. It'll apply the moat framework that I talk about in a moat stress section. And if any of the new information that I've given it or that it's come out in a quarterly report is going to affect the moat, it'll read the bias section of my brain. A lot of those notes are derived from Daniel Kahneman's work in Thinking Fast and Slow on anchoring bias and confirmation bias, the halo effect. And then it'll actually make me a note and give me kind of a debrief of that stress test. Next is the new idea intake. Here it'll make sure that the name isn't already in my second brain. It'll run it against the full checklist. It'll then identify a potential moat that the company might have and frame evaluation through the discounted cash flow notes I have and how I go through my valuation process. And then again, it can make me a note and give me kind of a debrief, and then I'll be able to decide whether I want to keep that note more permanently, add to it, augment it, things like that. Next is the portfolio fit check. This one's pretty self-explanatory. It'll cross-check a potential new investment with what I already have in my portfolio, look at concentration, any earnings power overlap, downside coverage, moat redundancy, etc. And then it'll give me an add, pass, replace. The last use case that I've given it so far is an earnings retest. This is more on, does it change my thesis? How is the moat affected? Am I anchored to this company or any of the previous metrics I've looked at? Here you can see in number 2 for earnings news / retest, identify which checklist items pass and which moat claims the news affects. For each affected item, was it a pass before? Is it still a pass? What changed? And then it'll give me a what to monitor next quarter, because it's important to have KPIs for how the business is performing so you can see how your investment thesis is playing out. So if we come back to the skill itself and how you can actually use it, I have all my context here, and then I can add a skill. I can add my investment context, and then it'll run that whole process every time I talk to Claude in natural language. I want to go over how I use this after Alphabet and Reddit reported earnings this quarter. So I asked it to make me a debrief note for each company with breakdowns on any data that could positively or negatively affect their respective moats, as well as KPIs that are positive data points from their recent quarterly reports and conference calls. I also told it to go over growth trends. You can see that it's written all this out, but I want to go over what it wrote out in my second brain. If we come back over to Obsidian, you can see that I've color-coded things as well. All these red tags are the individual tags that I have in my investment process second brain. And then all these white nodes are the individual notes that I label with the tags. And then the blue is the source material. And so the notes that Claude produces won't show up in here originally. Those will show up in the rough notes section. And so you can see, here is the note that Claude wrote out after I gave it that prompt. I want to go over the note that Claude made with all the notes that I have written down on my Reddit thesis combined with the quarterly earnings report. And so you can see immediately with the prompt that I gave it, it started combining some of those workflows that we just went over in Claude. You can see that it backtested against my existing thesis about the moat being the 100,000 plus decentralized communities that Reddit has. In my original thesis, I went over their daily active uniques in Q2 of 2025. I talked a little bit about the international ARPU gap relative to the US ARPU, which is one of the core parts of the thesis. So if we come down to this table that Claude has made us, it'll give us the metric, the recent performance, the growth trends, and what it means. So Reddit had a great quarter. Revenues accelerated almost 70% relative to 52% guidance. Advertising revenue was up to 74% with data licensing only at 15%. So in my original thesis, I had data licensing as a segment of revenues that could possibly be accelerating. This would be a negative piece of data relative to that thesis because we're not seeing accelerating growth with data licensing, meaning that Reddit's revenue could be even more concentrated in advertising moving forward, not more diversified, which is what I thought maybe could happen with their data licensing part of the business. Here we have daily active uniques as well, up 17%. This growth is slowing, but it's good to see that this is still up globally. So Reddit tracks logged out and logged in users for the next couple of quarters. They're shifting away from this metric. The logged out users is especially susceptible to Google's algorithms, and you can see that over here in the what it means section. But this is another good number. All of the ARPU metrics are up, with 44% globally, US up 22%, and international up 33%. These are great numbers. Hopefully this gap between international and US ARPU can continue to close. And then two of the last metrics I wanted to go over were the active advertisers and the lower funnel ad revenue share. These are two important pieces of data that we got from the recent report. This is one of the things that I wrote in the thesis that we wanted to see, a shift away from a concentrated group of ad spend, which is fueling the revenue growth. So when we see active advertisers up over 70%, we know that they're starting to get more and more people onto their ad platform. Lower funnel ad revenue share is a really important piece of data, with this now over 60% when it used to be less than 50%. This is due to their pivot to performance ads, which we can see is starting to work. These type of ads are generally more effective. This piece of data shows that this switch is starting to work. On a larger scale, we have growth slowing to around 62% year over year at midpoint, which is a modest deceleration, but still growing very quickly. And so now Claude is going to give us the growth trends relative to what my existing thesis says. On the advertising front, you can see granular subreddit targeting plus lower funnel pivot plus the AI ad stack, more diversification of advertiser base are generally confirming pieces of evidence from the original thesis that I went over in a previous video. That will also be linked below. Here gives us a reality check on some parts of the thesis. Advertising here is confirmed and accelerating. The single most important data point in the entire quarter is the lower funnel conversion revenue, now over 60% of ad sales. That is the performance ad pivot the existing note named and is now validated. It also explains the plus 75% active advertiser growth. Performance advertisers have return on investment math. They show up when the math works. The ARPU split, 32% impression growth plus 32% increase in ad pricing, is a healthy mix. Next, it's going to talk about the data licensing part of my thesis. Under threat of becoming less interesting. 39 million in Q1 grew only 15% year over year, slower than the rest of the business. As a percentage of total revenue, data licensing is at 6% and shrinking. The type of investor I am, I don't want to put much faith into this side of the business when I'm modeling out future cash flows. Claude pulled a quote from the earnings call that I also heard when I listened to it. Evolving negotiations anticipated around value beyond financial terms regarding the data licensing part of the business. This is kind of corporate speak for the renegotiation might not be straightforwardly bigger numbers, right? And so this new business segment that we've really never seen before as AI has started to grow in popularity is not something that we should be modeling out with relative certainty. The last part of my thesis that it talks about is the international monetization. So this is progressing at the user line, but slow at the ARPU line. International users are up, but international ARPU is still low relative to the US. The gap is closing in absolute terms, but the ratio of US ARPU relative to international ARPU is still 4x versus 4.5x in Q2 of 25. So this will be a multi-year grind and not a quarter-to-quarter unlock. The framing that I had in my original thesis of asymmetric upside in this monetization gap requires the ARPU gap to close. This is still intact, but the speed is just slow. It's then going to go over the moat impact. In the notes I have on Reddit's moat, I talked a little bit about how their content flywheel of users making content, interacting with that content, which then creates more content, being a flywheel. This is continuing to be confirmed in the numbers. This is the authentic context part of the moat. Next is that their performance ad stack continues to improve. We saw this with the lower funnel conversion revenue tripling that we went over earlier, another positive confirming data point. You can see that this metric tripling is the empirical proof that the subreddit level of targeting ads plus AI optimization actually drives advertiser ROI. This was one of the claims I made in my thesis in August of 2025, where I talked about Reddit's unique positioning of having their users self-identify as being interested in a product. This is now measured with a new form of ads, and so this is why we're seeing accelerated revenue. Again, we have the active advertiser count, the DAUQ and WAUs up, as well as margins increasing. Data licensing growth slowing, logged out user dependency on Google referrals, although this is increasing, so it seems as Google has integrated Gemini, this is actually feeding more people to Reddit, which could convert to more logged in users over time. Talks about the renegotiation on data licensing deals, although this won't really affect revenue that much because it is such a small segment of the business. I think the main risk right now is this ad cycle exposure. Because such a large percentage of their revenues do come from advertisements, if there's a decrease in advertising budgets, this could definitely affect my holdings in Google, but also Reddit. This is one of the main risks right now of my portfolio, is that I'm somewhat exposed to advertising budgets with larger positions in Google and Reddit. And then there is a modest deceleration in growth. When I originally valued this company, I used very conservative growth rates, even more of a deceleration than we're seeing in guidance, so I'm not really worried about that. In addition, Reddit also normally guides pretty low, and their beats have been by a pretty wide margin, but then again, Reddit is a fast-growing company, so it can be harder to model out than a larger company with a more stable growth rate. Here it gives us a list of the KPIs, and so I'll pull parts of this note and then make a more permanent note to add to my Reddit thesis within the investment process part of the second brain, which can then be used as context for further research I do into Reddit. So this is the flywheel that I talked about at the beginning of the video, how Claude and Obsidian will serve as a flywheel of investment knowledge and investment process refinement as the second brain and the context within Claude grows. If we come back over to the portfolio, you can see that I have a new investment in Adobe and that my investment in Reddit has started to do well. Google has continued to do well after earnings, but this video I'm not going to be going into Google's report. I really just wanted to show how I've started using Claude with my second brain and go over Reddit's recent earnings. I've linked to videos in the description of some of the foundational notes I have in my second brain that I use for Claude as context, as well as my initial video on Reddit. If you liked the video, please subscribe and hit the like button. See you guys in the next one.